Hi, I'm George Takei, and I invite you to draw your conclusions. The sudden passing of Justice Antonin Scalia, the most outspoken conservative on the Supreme Court, has left a divided court, split 4-4 on many controversial issues. The vacancy has set up a showdown between the President and Congress, not over who the replacement will be, but over when the replacement will occur. Not long after the news about Justice Scalia broke in February, Senate leaders vowed they would not hold hearings on any nomination until after the November election. President Obama responded that, as president, your job doesn't stop until you are voted out or until your term expires. He named his pick for the High Court in mid-March. As of today, Washington is still deadlocked. So, who's in the right? As Justice Scalia often urged, let's take a look first at what the Constitution says and at the framers' original intent. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution says that the President shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. The advice and consent clause makes clear that the responsibility over the composition of the judiciary rests with both other co-equal branches of government. The executive nominates, but the legislature must approve. This was a deliberate system of checks and balances debated at length by the Founding Fathers in Philadelphia back in 1787. Some wanted the court to be appointed by Congress, but James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, politely argued that members of the Congress do not have the requisite qualifications for selecting judges. James Wilson of Pennsylvania, a future member of the Supreme Court, was more blunt. Intrigue, partiality, and concealment would result from this, he intoned. Mr. Wilson favored appointment by the President, but Delegate John Rutledge of South Carolina feared that this would operate too much like a monarchy. And so they reached what we today seem so unable to reach, a compromise. The President nominates, provided the Senate must advise and consent. This system has worked as planned for nearly 230 years, but Senate leaders now threaten that record. They argue that because this is an election year, the appointment shouldn't become a political matter, and the country should wait 340 days until the next president is sworn in. There are a few problems with this. First, even in an election year, sitting presidents have made Supreme Court nominations. It happened 8 times last century, with 6 confirmed. President Reagan's appointee, Anthony Kennedy, who now sits on the court, was one of them. Presidents Hoover, Taft, and Harrison made appointments during elections that they ultimately lost. Nixon and Eisenhower also made election year appointments. In Ike's case, a recess appointment just 3 weeks right before the election itself. There isn't anything so special about this election that the process suddenly goes on hold. Second, even if there are high political stakes involved, that doesn't mean we should ignore what the Constitution says. In fact, looking again at original intent, the framers understood that there would be political consequences to vacancies. That's precisely why they set things up the way they did. In fact, just 8 years after the Constitution was adopted, George Washington nominated John Rutledge, the fellow from South Carolina who worried about American monarchies. But Congress shot him down because Rutledge opposed a popular treaty with Britain. The framers weren't afraid of political fights. On the contrary, they expected and expressly provided for them. Finally, there isn't anything in the language of the Constitution or the history of our nominating process that says we should wait so long to fill a vacancy. The average time it takes to confirm a Supreme Court justice is 25 days, and the longest it has ever taken is 125 days. So we're in new territory here, with the notion of waiting over 340 days. By refusing even to hear any nominee before the election, Senate leaders are setting a dangerous precedent. They are disturbing the careful balance of powers the framers had created. What is to stop future Senates from taking similar actions, perhaps even earlier in a president's term, with 400 or 500 days still remaining? And what happens if we need the Supreme Court to break a political logjam, as in the 2000 Bush-Gore election, or rule for one branch against another, as when it ordered President Nixon to turn over his tape recordings to Congress? A 4-4 ruling is as good as no ruling at all. The Supreme Court is like a referee at a ball game. If there isn't a ref, the game can't continue for long without someone to enforce the rules. Here, the rules state clearly that in the absence of a referee, the team with a ball picks one, but the other team has to agree. It's fair and it's clear. So that's my Civics 101 lesson. And now you're free to draw your conclusions.